Welcome to Catastrophes. This is a podcast about disasters. Why disasters happen, the factors that make them worse, and why some disasters occur differently than others. How disasters unfold, if you will. Today, we are discussing desertification. And if you've noticed, this is the first time I am using the camera and a little bit of a different recording platform, so I'm eager to hear how that is going. Um, I'm your host. My name is Brady Podlowski. I This is episode 15 of Catastrophes, and one of the purposes of recording via many different kinds of platforms is so that we could spread kind of the ongoing hazards and disasters that are kind of around the world. So before we get into desertification and kind of the barriers and what's going on about it, I wanted to first mention that the intent of exploring these disasters is not to demean or diminish the experiences that people are facing and encountering and experiencing with these particular hazards, but rather to explore, question, critique, and ask why these disasters are happening and why they're happening the way they are. Um, so, with that said, um, let's get into it. So, today we are discussing desertification. Um, I am recording this via my Mac using, recording different recording things. So, I'm going to be excited to hear how it comes across on audio and when it is uploaded to YouTube and Spotify. So, today we're going to be discussing what is desertification. Why does desertification occur? What is it? Where is it happening? And then some of its effects, and then what are some of the big projects that are ongoing to kind of curb it. So before we get into like desertification as a whole, I figured it was worth it to talk about slow onset disasters. So slow onset disasters are these slowly unfolding and occurring disasters that occur day by day, month by month, year by year. We really cannot tangibly see these disasters unfolding, but we see them through technology, through data, through satellite imagery. We see that some areas around the world are experiencing hazards. We just really can't perceive them. And that's an important point because the perception of a hazard and the perception that a disaster is occurring really influences how we respond to the disaster itself. So, desertification is one of these really pervasive and difficult disasters because it is slowly occurring and it is occurring, at a rate that you wouldn't see day to day. But over the course of years, you actually see it place a lot of pressure on population on and inhibiting population growth, but also on food, farming, and a bit of difficulties with um, how we are managing our forests around large deserts and things like that. So that's kind of the primer into desertification. It is this slow onset disaster. And if I could, uh, the moniker or the term creeping disaster is also used. And I don't necessarily love the word creeping disaster because it kind of entails that, we have these disasters that are creeping up on us that we really can't see, but they're creeping up on us until they appear and then boom, it's a surprise. But that's not necessarily the case. We know that most slow onset disasters are occurring and they're unfolding. So I use the term slow onset disaster. So with that said, what is desertification? Desertification is the expansion of deserts, plain and simple. There are natural sedimentation processes where desert dunes are moved and in turn where they are expanded outwards. And this is a pretty crucial point to desertification, but basically, as deserts expand, they expand outwards as well. So when we discuss today's one of today's deserts, which is the Sahara Desert, which is located in uh, Africa, in the northern part of Africa, and it has a number of different countries. So, one of which, Burkina Faso, Chad, Mauritania, Mali, all of these countries are experiencing desertification in kind of a different means. And when we look at this region, which we call the Sahel, which is that um, kind of that Western Africa where the Sahara Desert is, the Sahel is estimated to have an, around 1 billion people at risk from desertification. So when we look at kind of the causes of desertification as a whole, we have this natural process of sedimentation, which is increasing the size of deserts. But humans can actually increase the speed at which desertification occurs and the areas that it occurs to. Um, so, starting at, I guess, the top of the causes, I guess you could say, one of the difficulties of um, people living near deserts is that, well, if you are living near a desert, well, you need food to live there. You need space to live there. You also need water to live. And the increase in food demand, in water scarcity, and food and water demand can also lead to desertification occurring. So it's somewhat intuitive, but if you are moving to places near a desert or around a desert, um, and just in general, if your population is growing, your country is growing, um, the development of your country somewhat needs to be uh, aligned with food growth, and you're going to need more food if there's more people. So this is to say that there is a somewhat of a drive of the population growth in some of these areas and the amount of food that they need. Um, and we'll get into this point a little bit separately when we discuss farming practices and the need for more food. But I really quickly want to just touch on climate change. Over the last 50 to 100 years, the climate of the Sahel, in particularly, has become a little bit more dry. Um, and the use of the resources around the desert and underneath the desert, underground water, uh, aquifers, and reserves, well, they haven't been able to recharge as much. In addition, the areas around the deserts are actually becoming a little bit more dry. And so, what we know is that for climate change, the patterns that we are used to and that our world is used to are somewhat being disrupted. And so basically, some areas are seeing less rain. As we know, in Morocco, some areas in the Sahara Desert are actually seeing more rain than they've ever seen before. So, this is to say, climate change is influencing different parts of the Sahel and of the Sahara Desert differently. There's not one blanket answer. Different areas are going to experience different effects from the climate itself. So, just wanted to point that out because I oftentimes see whenever you even look to research this topic of desertification and just climate change in general, see, well, it's way more dry, so it's just going to be causing problems that way. But the inverse is also true. We're also seeing different rain patterns and different amounts of water in particular areas. So that's a quick aside. Desertification causes. So yes, climate change, a shifting in the dryness and the precipitation. We talked about the human impact of human growth. If there's more people and our world has seen an increase in population growth over the last 100 years, there's going to be a demand for more food. And that leads to farming. So farming practices are quite interesting. Particularly when we look at the 70s and 80s in the Sahel countries and in just West Africa in general, there was a number of um, development strategies that I would say failed. And we call them structural adjustment programs, SAPs. I don't want to go too far into it, but they were really the start for this increase in desertification, and it really um, amplified the rate of desertification in some of these Sahel countries. So, one of the implications of these structural adjustment programs is that farmers were needing to farm more luxury goods, but then it also made them need to farm more. And there was two reasons. Number one, they could only make so much money based on some of the things that they were farming. So they had to increase the space that they were farming. And what that entailed is actually cutting down trees and deforesting and de-shrubbing, I guess you could say, areas around farmlands and areas that were close to the Sahara Desert. Um, so, I guess to oversimplify, uh, poor farming practices were a little bit of the impetus for desertification to occur in the Sahara, around the Sahara, sorry. Not only did over farming or the practice of overusing the um, natural minerals and sediment in the ground cause somewhat of a shift in the soil quality, but then also overgrazing pastoral land, livestock. And then when we talk about, over cultivating or using one type of crop, which would basically lead to some sort of soil deficiency in minerals, all these farming practices, what they did is they made land um, somewhat not unstable, but it had a difficult effect. It made farmers need to farm more, whether that was longer, but also expanding their areas. So again, going back to overgrazing, overcultivating, and then not using different crops led to having to farm more area, and that led to deforesting and also just drier conditions around the Sahara Desert. And that's difficult because that is kind of those are one of the huge drivers of desertification around the Sahara Desert is kind of this informal land management and cutting down of trees, expanding of farms, and different practices. So in the Sahara, we know that, well, there's roughly 1-ish billion people who are at risk of desertification, or they are seeing impacts from desertification. So that's the cause, and there's a number of different research and great initiatives that have really synthesized this topic much better than I could. I highly suggest you take a look at them. The United Nations has a number of different initiatives where they have really been able to drive home the point and able to create a number of areas where they've implemented a project and it's really worked. So, with that said, I wanted to talk about one project that I really see as being one foundational, but then two, being able to stop, or I guess you could say stabilize desertification. So again, when we go back to this idea of slow onset disasters, slow onset disasters are really difficult for emergency management agencies, governments to manage because there's really not a start to these disasters, nor is there really a endpoint. There's not a stabilization metric. And so when we talk about just like funding, the practicalities of managing a disaster, that's really difficult to manage if there's no start or end point. There's no way to say I'm going to pay for this portion of the disaster, the response portion, because it happened in this particular time period. Whereas desertification is happening over years and it's happening slowly to the point that you can't really point and say that, oh, on this day, this event happened and it caused this much money to be, it caused this much money to fix. Desertification occurs over time, and then it also has these subsequent effects of, making it more dry or influencing the land around some areas. So this is to say, disaster management has a lot of difficulty with managing slow onset disasters. And so, some of the research that I found is that it's actually the large, really long term, small, sustainable projects that are very effective in managing these slow onset disasters. So, the project we're going to talk about today is called the Great Green Wall, and it is in the southern Sahara. And whenever I talked about the Great Green Wall beforehand, I always envisioned it as a row of trees that was on the southern side of the Sahara Desert, and basically it was a bunch of trees that were green and that would stop the desert from expanding. But that is not the case, and I don't want you to have that vision either. So there are 11 countries in um, the Sahel that we mentioned that are a part of this initiative. I want to say Senegal, Burkina Faso, Sudan, Chad, Central African Republic, Mali, Nigeria, and a few others. And I'm missing them, and I apologize. I should be better. um, but they are a part of this initiative to basically restore green space to prevent the desert from expanding. So it is not just a row of green and grassy trees and grassland that is stopping the desert. It's actually reintegrating and implementing new initiatives for green spaces, for land that is sustainably managed. So not only does it include forestry, but it also includes agricultural, water, and soil management. So to give you a bit more information, there's a few different projects, different pieces of the Great Green Wall initiative that I picked on. This is one of them. These 11 countries have initiated a number of sustainable land management practices in forestry agricultural, where they are implementing reforestation, land restoration, and agroforestry, which is agriculture and forestry put together. And basically, they're managing and maintaining the forests and the agricultural, and they're growing these green spaces and making sure that they're sustainable for the long term. A little bit of a cool factor of the economic implication that you're providing farmers more land and more space in the long term to be able to farm, but then you're also reintroducing forests and trees and grassland and natural habitable spaces that animals used to once have. And the added benefit is that it is, again, not the added benefit, but the primary benefit is that this is reducing desertification and in turn stopping it. The secondary part that this particular resource talks about is water, and they're actually improving irrigation and watershed management practices. And this is a really cool and probably bigger point that we should talk about later on. But water management, whether it is fresh water, whether it is agricultural water, whether it is water we are using to make sure our crops are able to grow, the management of how we go about using water in these spaces for the Great Green Wall is actually changing, and it has become a little bit more sustainable. Finally, the soil and the soil practices are a little bit more nuanced, and I'm not sure I particularly fully understand them myself, so I didn't really want to synthesize it and kind of give you a half-assed delivery of what the soil management process was. But basically, the forestry, agricultural, soil, and water management and the reintroduction of green spaces that are sustainable is what the Great Green Wall is. And it does happen somewhat in a row. Um, Pulling up my notes, they have actually restored over 100 million hectares of degraded land, and they've created 10 million green jobs in areas. And that's by 2030. But from last time I checked, they've actually done a significant amount of that work. So, the Great Green Wall is one of these transformative projects that disaster basically management um, needs to be thinking of and can be able to take on and emulate elsewhere. And I think it's relevant. So when we just talk about desertification, I forgot to mention the hazards and the effects, but again, the dry, the dryness it causes, the difficulty in, oops, the difficulty in a dry climate and what that does to soil can be really harmful to farmers, but then people around, people uh, moving basically in areas around. Um, it can also influence drought, and I think that was one of the important hazards that I really wanted to mention. So, just taking a step back, I really see slow onset disasters not only having their effects themselves. So, for desertification causing drier areas and kind of taking space away very, very, very slowly. But desertification also has the added consequence of increasing the amount of drought, um, drought and famines that occur. Um, and I think those are two really important topics to just think about when in terms of climate desertification, because as the deserts expand, those hazards become more likely to occur, and they may increase in frequency. Sorry, not in frequency, in intensity. The scale at which they occur is worsened. So, uh, with that said, that is all I got for today. Um, I hope people like the new visual audio component. I tried my best to put in some relevant graphics for people who are watching on YouTube. If you are new to the channel, you are new to the podcast, uh, if you are wanting a disaster kind of deciphered what has happened, feel free to email me at catastrophepodcast@gmail.com. I'm also more active on the social medias these days and checking the YouTube comments. Um, so if you like today's episode, please feel free to let me know or give me a like um, or a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. And that is all I got for you today. Thank you for joining.